When the coffin lid closed, he weighed only 110 pounds. The 300-pound giant from the screen had vanished, leaving behind only a skeletal young man consumed by illness. It was a child forced to trade his own lifespan for applause. Norman Chaney's lonely death at 21 was more tragic than any movie script ever written. He beat out 2,000 rivals to become the most famous fat kid in cinema history, an icon of the legendary Our Gang series. But those pinchable cheeks weren't cute. They were symptoms of a glandular time bomb that needed a doctor, not a director. Hollywood turned a medical emergency into a cash cow, and when he broke, they tossed him aside. This is the brutal truth about the saddest boy in show business. The story begins far from the palm trees and sound stages of Culver City, California. It begins in the humid, quiet streets of Cambridge, Maryland. Norman Myers Chaney was born on October 18, 1914. His arrival gave no hint of the anomaly that would define his life. He was a healthy, unremarkable infant, weighing in at 3.6 kilograms, roughly 8 pounds. His parents, George and Margaret Chaney, were people of average build and modest means. George was an electrician, a practical man working with his hands to build a life in a world on the brink of the First World War. Margaret was a homemaker, keeping their home together. In the genetic lineage of the Chaney family, there was no precedent for gigantism or extreme obesity. There were no stories of ancestors who could not fit through doorways. Norman was expected to grow up, perhaps take up a trade like his father, and live a quiet life on the Eastern Shore. However, the genetic script flipped somewhere between his first and second birthdays. By the time Norman was a toddler, the terrifying nature of his condition began to reveal itself with aggressive speed. While other children were learning to walk and climb, stretching vertically, Norman was expanding horizontally. His growth was not a curve, it was a spike. By the age of 3.5, a time when most children are light enough to be carried on a hip, Norman tipped the scales at a staggering 51 kilograms, over 110 pounds. To put this into perspective, at less than 4 years old, the toddler weighed more than his own mother. He was a biological impossibility to those who saw him, a marvel of mass that defied the caloric intake of a child his age. The Chaney family was baffled and terrified. In the 1920s, the field of endocrinology, the study of hormones and glands, was in its infancy. The intricate dance of the pituitary gland, the thyroid, and the hypothalamus was largely a map with blank spaces marked, "Here be monsters." George and Margaret took their son to local doctors, seeking answers. Why was their son growing so rapidly? Why did his body seem to hoard every ounce of energy it consumed? The medical consensus was dismissive and tragically incorrect. Doctors waved off the parents' concerns with platitudes that seem negligent by modern standards. "It's just baby fat," they said. "He has a hearty appetite. He'll grow out of it," they assured. They were wrong. Norman was not suffering from gluttony. He was suffering from a severe, unmanaged glandular defect. Modern medical historians reviewing the records and photographs of Norman's development suspect a malfunction of the pituitary gland or a severe hypothyroid condition. His body was a metabolic trap. It stored fat relentlessly and refused to burn it, regardless of his activity level. Despite the crushing weight, Norman defied the stereotype of the lethargic, slow-witted giant. He was remarkably active. He was sharp, sociable, and possessed a vibrant, magnetic personality. Unlike many children who might withdraw due to physical differences, Norman developed a disarming gentleness. He refused to be bedridden. He played, he ran, and he developed a quick wit, perhaps a defense mechanism developed early to beat bullies to the punch. Neighbors from Cambridge later recalled that Norman was exceptionally polite, often apologizing for taking up space in crowded rooms, a heartbreaking indicator that he was aware of his burden even before he could fully articulate it. But in the small town of Cambridge, Maryland, he was inevitably reduced to a curiosity. He was the boy mountain, a local attraction. In Maryland, being a curiosity was a burden, but 3,000 miles away in the cutthroat business of Hollywood, a curiosity was a commodity. By 1929, the entertainment industry was undergoing a seismic shift. The talkies had arrived, destroying the careers of silent film stars who couldn't act with their voices and birthing a new generation of performers. Amidst this revolution, the Our Gang franchise, Hal Roach's crown jewel, was facing a casting crisis. The premise of Our Gang relied on a specific chemistry of children: the leader, the tough guy, the pretty girl, the rich snob, and the fat kid. For years, the role of the fat kid had been inhabited by Joe Cobb. Cobb was a talented comedic actor and a fan favorite, but nature was taking its course. Joe Cobb was aging. As Cobb approached his teenage years, the baby fat that made him cute was melting away, replaced by the average build of an adolescent. To Hal Roach, a slim Joe Cobb was useless. The visual gag was gone. The studio didn't want a teenager with a complex inner life. They wanted a sphere with a face. They needed a visual anchor for their slapstick routines. Roach, a man known for his sharp business acumen and ruthless production schedules, decided to solve the problem with a nationwide manhunt. He didn't just want a replacement, he wanted an upgrade. He wanted the heaviest child in America. The search for the new fat kid was launched with the subtlety of a circus parade. It was 1929, the year the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began its suffocating grip on the American populace. Desperation was in the air. The query went out via newspapers and radio: Hal Roach is looking for a heavy kid. The response was overwhelming. Estimates of the turnout vary, with some studio publicity claiming 2,000 applicants and others inflating the number to 20,000. Regardless of the exact figure, it was a stampede. It was a cattle call in the most literal sense. Parents, terrified of poverty and dreaming of Hollywood gold, pushed their overweight children into the spotlight. Imagine the scene. Thousands of children, many of whom likely suffered from untreated medical conditions similar to Norman's, lined up in auditoriums and contest halls. They were poked, prodded, weighed, and measured. They were asked to make funny faces, to wobble, to fall down. It was a pageant of physical anomalies, fueled by the hope of a paycheck. In Cambridge, Maryland, the Chaney family heard the call. Norman was now roughly 14 years old. He stood only 3 feet 11 inches tall, just shy of 1.2 meters, but he weighed a bone-crushing 113 pounds. His BMI was off the charts. He was denser, wider, and visually more striking than Joe Cobb ever was. Norman had a natural charisma. He liked to perform. He liked to make people laugh. For his parents, this wasn't just about fame. It was perhaps a way to give their son a life where his size was an asset rather than a curse. They traveled to the audition, joining the throngs of hopefuls. When Norman Myers Chaney walked into the audition room, the competition effectively ended. Hal Roach and his casting directors took one look at the boy from Maryland and knew they had found their star. Norman didn't just meet the criteria, he shattered them. He possessed a unique physical geometry, a round, expressive face set atop a body that seemed almost spherical. But more importantly, he had it. Unlike many of the shy, uncomfortable children dragged there by their parents, Norman lit up the room. He was surprisingly intelligent, far more so than the character he would eventually play. While other children stumbled over instructions, Norman listened intently. He had a distinctive, raspy voice, a result of the pressure on his vocal cords and his hormonal imbalance that recorded beautifully on the primitive microphones of the era. He was quick-witted. He could take direction. He had a smile that could melt the heart of the sternest producer. He was hired on the spot. The offer was laid out, a contract with Hal Roach Studios. The starting salary was $100 a week. In 2024, $100 might seem like a pittance. But in 1929, as banks failed and breadlines formed around street corners, $100 a week was a fortune. It was more than most grown men could hope to earn in a month of backbreaking labor. It was a golden ticket. It promised a life of luxury, travel, and adoration. But every contract has fine print, visible or invisible. In exchange for that weekly check, Norman Chaney had to sign away his identity. He had to sign away his dignity. He was handed a train ticket to California. He packed his bags, leaving behind the custom-built desks of his Maryland school and the stares of his neighbors. He was heading to the Dream Factory. He boarded the train as Norman Myers Chaney. But by the time he arrived in Hollywood, Norman would effectively cease to exist. In his place stood a character, a caricature, a commodity. The studio gave him a new name, one that would stick to him like tar for the rest of his short life. He was now Chubby. When Norman Chaney stepped off the train in Los Angeles in 1929, he stepped into a world that was vibrating with nervous energy. Hollywood was in the throes of a violent metamorphosis. The talkies, films with synchronized sound, had arrived with the release of The Jazz Singer just 2 years prior, and the industry was scrambling to adapt. Silent film stars, gods and goddesses of the screen whose voices didn't match their faces, were being unceremoniously dumped. Studios were desperate for actors who could speak, sing, and handle the rhythm of dialogue. For Norman, this timing was serendipitous. While his body was the initial hook, it was his voice that sealed his fate. He didn't sound like a child. He possessed a gravelly, resonant rasp, a byproduct of the immense pressure his enlarged thyroid and fatty tissue placed on his vocal cords. It was a voice that commanded attention, distinct and instantly recognizable. It cut through the primitive, static-filled audio recording technology of the time. Hal Roach knew instantly. This kid didn't just look funny, he sounded funny. Norman was whisked to the Lot of Fun, the famous Hal Roach Studios in Culver City. It was a sprawling playground of imagination, a place where lions roamed for Tarzan shoots and Laurel and Hardy stumbled through doorframes. But for the child actors of our gang, it was also a workplace with the rigor of a factory floor. Norman was quickly integrated into the ensemble. He wasn't given time to adjust to the climate or the culture. He was thrown into the mix with veterans like Jackie Cooper, Alan Farina Hoskins, and Mary Ann Jackson. These children were pros. They knew where the camera was. They knew how to hit their marks, and they knew how to steal a scene. Norman had to learn to swim in the deep end immediately. Norman's first credit was the short film Boxing Gloves, released in 1929. The premise was a classic Our Gang setup. The kids organize a boxing match. The script needed a referee, someone who could physically separate the combatants, but who was clearly not a combatant himself. Enter Chubby. In his debut, the visual hierarchy is established instantly. Norman is dressed in oversized trousers, his suspenders straining against the physics of his torso. The camera loves him, but it loves him for the wrong reasons. It lingers on his waddle. It frames him squeezed against the ropes, his flesh spilling over the canvas. Yet even in this first role, Norman's natural charisma shines through. He wasn't stiff. He had a natural sense of timing. When chaos erupted, as it always did in these films, Norman reacted with a genuine wide-eyed bewilderment that audiences found irresistible. He didn't just stand there. He inhabited the space. He was the anchor of the scene, the immense planet around which the smaller, faster kids orbited. The film was a hit. The transition from Joe Cobb to Norman Chaney was seamless. The audience accepted the new fat kid without hesitation. The studio breathed a sigh of relief. The cog had been replaced. The machine could keep turning. This was not merely a case of a child standing in front of a camera. Norman brought a specific, distinct energy that differed from Cobb's. While Cobb was jolly, Norman was often portrayed as baffled, a sweet soul constantly confused by the chaos around him. In the 1930 film Pups as Pups, Norman stole the show not with dialogue but with physical comedy that utilized his size in a way that felt almost balletic. In one memorable sequence, the gang is at a pet show, and chaos ensues when fleas attack. Norman's reaction, wriggling, twitching, and eventually dancing in a frantic attempt to scratch the itch, displayed a level of bodily control that belied his mass. He wasn't just a prop, he was a performer who understood the rhythm of a scene. If boxing gloves was the introduction, the 1931 film Love Business was the coronation. This short film remains one of the most beloved entries in the entire Little Rascals canon, and it contains the sequence that would define Norman's legacy forever. The plot revolves around the gang's collective crush on their beautiful school teacher, Miss Crabtree. In a bid to win her heart, the boys visit her boarding house. While Jackie Cooper plays the smooth-talking suitor, Norman plays the eager, bumbling sidekick. The script called for Norman to be charming, but in a way that infantilized him despite his size. In the iconic scene, Miss Crabtree asks him his name. Norman, dressed in a suit that emphasizes his girth, looks up at her with a mixture of shyness and bravado, grabs the lapel of his jacket, flutters his eyelids with a precision that speaks to his underrated acting ability, and delivers the line, "Don't call me Norman, call me Chubsy Ubsy." It was a line designed to be repeated. It was viral decades before the internet. The audience cooed. It was adorable. But looking back through the lens of history, the line is a branding iron. It was the studio stripping away Norman, the boy from Maryland, and fully cementing the caricature. He was telling the world that his identity was his weight. He was Chubsy. He was Ubsy. He was a soft, round thing to be squeezed and laughed at. Behind the scenes, the cast loved him, but they also recognized the sorrow in his situation. Jackie Cooper, who would go on to have the most successful career of the bunch, later wrote about Norman with a mix of affection and pity. Cooper noted that while Norman was always laughing on the outside, there was a palpable sense of physical discomfort radiating from him. Cooper recalled moments where Norman would have to pause between takes, his chest heaving, wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief he kept tucked in his oversized pocket. But it was Matthew Stymie-Beard who provided the most touching insight into Norman's true character. Stymie, who often felt like an outsider himself, later revealed that Norman was his favorite member of the gang. He described Norman not as a clown, but as the nicest guy on the lot, a boy who never lost his temper, even when the director's demands were humiliating. It was said that Norman, possessing a mind far sharper than his character, would memorize the entire script, not just his own lines. On days when the younger or more forgetful actors stumbled, it was often Norman who gently whispered their cues to them, saving them from the director's wrath, never taking credit for his quiet leadership. Norman was known for spending his weekly stipend on treats for the other kids, using his money to buy friendship in a world where he was physically isolated. He would buy ice cream for Matthew Stymie-Beard and the others, watching them eat with a generous smile. He was the gentle giant of the lot, never raising his voice, never complaining even when the stunts bordered on abusive. but the kindness of his peers couldn't protect him from the cruelty of the scripts. As Norman's tenure continued through 1930 and 1931, the physical demands of the role began to escalate. Comedy in the Hal Roach style was kinetic. It was violent. It relied on the pratfall, the art of falling down funny. For a child of average weight, a pratfall is a bruise. For Norman Chaney, whose weight was rapidly climbing toward 200 pounds and beyond, a pratfall was a seismic shock to the skeletal system. The studio had no concept of ergonomics or medical safety for a child with a glandular disorder. If the script said Chubby falls off a chair, Norman fell off the chair. If the script said Chubby gets stuck in a window, Norman had to wedge himself into a frame until he was genuinely stuck, his ribs compressed, his breathing shallow, while the cameras rolled and the directors shouted for more flailing. There were scenes where he was required to eat. In Hollywood shorthand, fat characters were always hungry. It was the laziest form of characterization. Norman was filmed eating piles of pancakes, giant sandwiches, and mountains of mashed potatoes. For a boy whose body was already in a state of metabolic crisis, hoarding every calorie due to hormonal failure, force-feeding him for multiple takes was akin to poisoning him. The studio was literally feeding the disease that would eventually kill him, all for the sake of a 10-second gag. His knees ached. His back was under constant strain. The simple act of standing for long periods under the hot studio lights was exhausting. He would sweat profusely, his heavy wool suits becoming soaked. In films like Shiver My Timbers, where the kids played pirates, Norman was outfitted in a heavy costume that trapped heat. He had to perform on a rocking set, maintaining his balance while carrying nearly 300 pounds of weight. Yet, when the director yelled "action," Norman smiled. He did the slow burn. He took the fall. He was a professional in a child's body, enduring chronic pain to deliver the laugh. By late 1931, the tragedy of biology began to catch up with the fantasy of film. When Norman was hired, he was roughly 14, but his condition made him look like an oversized toddler. He had a baby face, round, smooth, and hairless. This ambiguity allowed him to play a character much younger than his actual age. But Norman was human. He hit puberty. Nature is relentless. Even with his glandular issues, Norman began to grow up. He grew taller, eventually reaching roughly 4 feet 7 inches. His voice deepened further. The cute baby fat began to redistribute into the heavier, more cumbersome carriage of a morbidly obese adult. The toddler-like charm was evaporating, replaced by the reality of a teenager trapped in a failing body. To Hal Roach, this was a disaster. A fat little boy is a comedy goldmine. A morbidly obese teenager is a tragedy. It makes the audience uncomfortable. It stops being cute and starts being sad. The studio executives watched the dailies and saw the change. They saw that Norman was getting heavier, yes, but not in the way they wanted. He was looking ill. His movements were becoming more labored. The spark in his eyes was battling against visible fatigue. He had appeared in 19 films. He had given them Teacher's Pet, School's Out, and Love Business. He had defined the era. But in the cold calculus of Hollywood, you are only as valuable as your last laugh. The end did not come with a bang. There was no farewell gala. There was no Lifetime Achievement Award for the boy who had broken his body for the studio. After the production of Fly My Kite in 1931, the decision was made. In that final film, the cruelty of his physical condition was on full display. The script required Norman to be suspended in the air, his body weight literally acting as the ballast for a kite gag. It was a humiliating visual. The boy as a literal anchor, a dead weight. The strain on his face was real. The heavy breathing was not acting. He was 17 years old. The studio system of the 1930s was notoriously exploitative regarding contracts. Actors, especially children, were paid a flat weekly fee. There were no royalties, there were no residuals. Every time the Little Rascals aired on television in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, generating millions of dollars in ad revenue, Norman Chaney's estate received zero. When the weekly checks stopped, the income stopped instantly. Norman was told to pack his things. He handed back the costumes that had been custom made to fit his ever-expanding waistline. He said goodbye to Jackie Cooper and the rest of the gang, who were also cycling out as they aged. He walked off the Hal Roach lot for the last time, a 300-pound teenager with a famous face and an empty bank account. The Chubby merchandise, dolls, comics, posters, remained on store shelves, selling his likeness. But Norman himself was no longer required. He boarded a train back to Baltimore. The journey east must have been agonizing. He was leaving the sunshine and the limelight to return to the gray reality of the Depression-era East Coast. He was returning not as a conquering hero, but as a curiosity who had outlived his usefulness. He was returning to a world that wasn't built for him, in a body that was rapidly betraying him. The laughter was over. The silence was about to begin. The train ride from Los Angeles back to Baltimore in late 1931 was more than just a cross-country trip. It was a journey between two incompatible dimensions. Norman Chaney boarded the train in California as a recognizable celebrity, a boy whose face had beamed from silver screens in thousands of theaters across America. He disembarked in Maryland as an unemployed teenager in the grip of the Great Depression, carrying nothing but a suitcase and a body that had become a national punchline. There is a profound psychological whiplash that occurs when the spotlight is abruptly turned off. For 2 years, Norman's obesity had been his ticket to acceptance. It was his job. His size was praised, lit carefully, and framed for maximum effect. On the Hal Roach lot, being 300 pounds meant he was chubsy-ubsy, a valuable asset. But as he stepped onto the platform in Baltimore, the context shifted violently. In the real world, being a 300-pound teenager wasn't funny. It was a medical anomaly. It was a burden. The stares he received on the streets of Baltimore weren't the adoring gazes of fans waiting for an autograph. They were the confused, pitying, and sometimes cruel looks of strangers witnessing a spectacle. Norman returned to his parents' modest home, a house that suddenly felt much smaller. The checks from Hal Roach Studios had stopped. The royalties were non-existent. The Chaney family was back to where they started, working-class people trying to survive an economic collapse, but now burdened with a son whose medical needs were escalating by the day. Determined to give their son a normal life, George and Margaret Chaney enrolled Norman in the Baltimore public school system. It was a decision born of hope, but it collided instantly with the physical reality of Norman's condition. The American school system of the 1930s was designed for uniformity, rows of identical desks, rigid schedules, and a culture of conformity. Norman Chaney was the antithesis of uniformity. On his first day at Public School 80, the logistical nightmare became immediately apparent. Norman, now approaching 300 pounds and standing roughly 4 feet 7 inches tall, could not fit into a standard school desk. He couldn't even squeeze into the larger desks reserved for the older boys. The fixed wooden chair desk combinations of the era were traps for a boy of his girth. The school administration, faced with a student who physically could not be seated, had to intervene. In a move that was meant to be accommodating but ultimately served to isolate him further, they commissioned a custom piece of furniture. A carpenter was brought in to construct a reinforced, extra-wide oak desk and chair specifically for Norman. Imagine the psychology of this setup. Every morning, Norman would walk into class, likely breathing heavily from the exertion of just moving his own mass, and sit in a piece of furniture that looked different from everyone else's. It was a wooden island. It screamed to the other students, "This boy is different. This boy does not belong." Despite the physical barriers, Norman was intellectually capable. Surviving studio records and school reports suggest he was a bright student, earning good grades, particularly excelling in mathematics. It was a cruel paradox. He had a mind built for logic, precision, and order, trapped in a body that was chaotic and ungovernable. He was often the first to raise his hand to solve an algebra equation, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of the answer, even as his classmates snickered at the effort it took him to simply stand up to recite it. He had a sharp mind, honed by the quick memorization required on movie sets. Teachers noted that behind the slow appearance, his weight suggested there was an agile and curious intellect that was desperate for engagement. He was a reader, consuming books to escape a reality where his body was a prison. But socially, his life was a solitary confinement. Adolescence is a time of desperate desire for peer acceptance. Teenagers want to blend in, to date, to play sports, to be part of the gang. For Norman, these doors were welded shut. He couldn't run around the baseball diamond. His joints were under too much pressure. He couldn't attend school dances. Who would dance with the boy who was wider than he was tall? The fame he had garnered in Hollywood became a double-edged sword. To his classmates, he wasn't just the fat kid. He was that fat kid. He was a celebrity, which created a weird distance. Some kids wanted to be near him for the novelty. Others bullied him to feel superior to a movie star. He was trapped in the persona of Chubby Ubsy. Even when he tried to be serious, to be just Norman, the world projected the clown upon him. He had spent 2 years training audiences to laugh at him, and now he couldn't stop them. Between 1932 and 1935, the situation devolved from difficult to critical. Without the enforced activity of the movie set, where directors made him run, fall, and move for hours a day, Norman became more sedentary. It wasn't laziness, it was physics. Moving 300 pounds on a 4'7" frame required colossal energy. The more he sat, the heavier he got. The heavier he got, the harder it was to move. It was a vicious cycle. His weight crept upward, defying all logic. He was heavier than heavyweight boxing champions of the era, yet he was the height of a child. His body mass index would have been in a category that modern medicine struggles to define. He began to suffer from severe sleep apnea, likely gasping for air at night as the weight of his neck compressed his windpipe. He suffered from edema, his legs swelling with fluid. His heart, a muscle the size of a fist, was trying to pump blood through a body mass 3 times the size it was designed for. Norman was slowly suffocating inside his own skin. By 1935, Norman was 21 years old. In the eyes of the law, he was a man. In the eyes of medical science, he was a ticking time bomb. George and Margaret Chaney watched their son fading. The jovial spark was gone, replaced by chronic exhaustion and pain. They knew that if they didn't do something drastic, Norman would not see his 25th birthday. In a final act of desperation, they looked toward the beacon of medical hope in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins Hospital. They didn't know it yet, but they were walking Norman toward a precipice. The doctors at Johns Hopkins would indeed find a way to stop the weight gain. They would find a way to strip the fat from his body, but the price of the cure would be higher than the toll of the disease. In 1935, entering Johns Hopkins Hospital was akin to entering a cathedral. It was a place of hushed reverence, where the high priests of American medicine practiced the cutting edge of science. For the Chaney family, walking through those doors was a final gamble. They were placing Norman's life on the altar of modern medicine, hoping for a miracle that diet and prayer had failed to provide. Norman was admitted as an inpatient. By this time, his weight had plateaued at a crushing 300 pounds. Standing at just 4 feet 7 inches, his dimensions were nearly cubic. He was a medical marvel, a case study that attracted the attention of the senior staff. The doctors conducted a battery of tests, primitive by today's standards, but state-of-the-art for the Depression era. They measured his basal metabolic rate. They analyzed his blood. They scrutinized the geography of his skull via X-ray to look at the sella turcica, the bony cup that holds the pituitary gland. Their diagnosis confirmed what had been suspected but never treated: a profound glandular dysfunction. Whether it was a pituitary tumor, extreme hypothyroidism, or a combination of endocrine failures, the verdict was clear. Norman's internal engine was broken. His body was stuck in a mode of frantic accumulation. The doctors proposed a treatment plan. In 2024, such a condition might be managed with precise synthetic hormones, laparoscopic surgery, or carefully titrated medication. In 1935, endocrinology was a blunt instrument. The treatment for glandular hyperactivity or malfunction was often surgical removal or aggressive radiation, combined with high-dose experimental drug therapies designed to shock the metabolism back into line. The Cheneys signed the consent forms. They had no choice. To do nothing was a death sentence. They didn't know that the cure would be just as lethal. The treatment began, and the reaction of Norman's body was violent and immediate. The goal was weight loss. The result was a biological collapse. Almost immediately after the interventions began, Norman started to lose weight. At first, it must have seemed like a blessing. The numbers on the scale, which had only ever gone up for 21 years, finally began to tick down. 290, 280, 270. But then the descent accelerated. It became a free fall. Norman's metabolism, jump-started by the aggressive therapy, swung from hibernation to hyperconsumption. His body began to burn through its reserves with terrifying speed. It didn't just burn fat, it began to scavenge muscle and tissue. He was losing weight at a rate that the human heart and organs are not designed to withstand. He was dropping pounds by the day. The chubsy-ubsy silhouette, the round cheeks, the massive belly, the tree-trunk legs began to deflate. For Norman, this transformation was likely a psychological nightmare. We often celebrate weight loss as a triumph, but when it happens this fast and this uncontrollably, it is a trauma. As the fat melted away, it left behind the wreckage of his skin. Skin that had been stretched to accommodate a 300-pound frame for nearly a decade did not snap back. It hung in heavy gray folds. It draped off his arms like wet canvas. It gathered around his waist in painful, chafing layers. He looked in the mirror and saw a stranger. The face that had made millions laugh, the round, moon-like visage, was gone. In its place was a gaunt, hollow-eyed mask. His cheekbones, buried since infancy, jutted out sharply. His eyes, once crinkled in a permanent smile, now looked huge and haunted in his shrinking skull. He was 21 years old, but he looked like an old man who had survived a famine. After months of treatment, Norman was discharged. The doctors had technically succeeded. They had cured his obesity. Norman left the hospital weighing approximately 110 pounds. He had lost nearly 140 pounds, almost 60% of his body weight, in a shockingly short period. He was now a tiny, frail figure. If you saw him on the street, you would never connect him to the jovial giant of the Our Gang films. He was unrecognizable. He moved into his maternal grandparents' home in Baltimore to recover, but there was no recovery to be had. The cure had ravaged his internal organs. His heart was the primary casualty. For years, his heart had enlarged to pump blood through 300 pounds of tissue. It had become a massive muscular engine. When the weight suddenly vanished, the heart couldn't simply shrink back down. It was left beating furiously against a resistance that was no longer there. He developed severe myocarditis, an inflammation of the heart muscle. He was also likely suffering from electrolyte imbalances and severe malnutrition caused by the metabolic crash. He was weak, constantly cold, and in pain. The winter of 1935 turned into the spring of 1936. Norman spent his days in bed. He complained of feeling perpetually cold, a cruel irony for a boy who had spent his life overheating. The layer of insulation he had carried was gone, leaving his nerves exposed. The world outside continued to turn. The Little Rascals shorts were still playing in theaters, delighting new audiences. In cinemas across the country, the ghost of Chubby was still stuck in windows, still eating pancakes, still laughing. But in the quiet bedroom in Baltimore, the real Norman Chaney was fading. He was surrounded by family. His mother, Margaret, cared for him with a breaking heart. They had spent everything they had to save him, only to watch him wither away. There is a tragic irony here. Hollywood had discarded him because he was too fat. Medicine had destroyed him to make him thin. Norman had spent his entire life being defined by his size. First too big, now too small. He never got to be just right. As May 1936 arrived, Norman grew weaker. He could barely lift his head. The raspy voice that had recorded so well was now a whisper. On May 29, 1936, the struggle ended. Norman Myers Chaney's heart, exhausted by the extreme demands of his life and the trauma of his treatment, finally stopped beating. He was 21 years old. At the time of his death, he weighed roughly 110 pounds. He was lighter than he had been at age 10. The circle was complete, but it was a circle of tragedy. The news of his death was a footnote. It appeared in local Baltimore papers and received small blurbs in Hollywood trade publications like Variety. "Former Our Gang actor dies," the headlines read. But where was the industry? Where were the moguls who had profited from his image? Hal Roach did not attend the funeral. There is no record of him sending flowers or financial support to the destitute family. Jackie Cooper, who had gone on to become a major star, did not attend. To be fair, Cooper was still a child himself and likely shielded from the news by his own handlers. The studio system had moved on. Norman was yesterday's news. He was a depreciated asset that had been written off the books years ago. The funeral was a small, somber affair held in Baltimore. There were no newsreel cameras. There were no crowds of weeping fans, just a grieving family and a few neighbors. The financial devastation of the Great Depression, combined with the astronomical medical bills from Johns Hopkins, had left the Chaney family with nothing. They could pay for the burial plot in Baltimore Cemetery, but they could not afford a headstone. They lowered Norman into the ground in a plain casket. The earth was filled in. Grass grew over the spot. For the next 76 years, there was nothing to mark the resting place of one of the most famous child stars in history. If you walked through Baltimore Cemetery, you would walk right past him without knowing. He was invisible in death, just as the real Norman had been invisible behind the character of Chubby in life. The resurrection of dignity. For 76 years, a strange dissonance existed in American pop culture. Throughout the mid-20th century, television became the dominant force in the household. As networks looked for content to fill their morning slots, they dusted off the old Hal Roach film reels. The Little Rascals became a staple of Saturday morning television. It was syndicated globally. It was colorized. It was packaged into VHS collections. and later DVDs. Generations of children, baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, grew up with the gang. They knew Spanky's scowl, Alfalfa's cowlick, and Chubby's jovial waddle. Norman Chaney was a guest in millions of living rooms every single week. He was immortal on the screen, frozen forever in that innocent slapstick childhood. But while his image was generating laughter and ad revenue, the physical remains of Norman Chaney lay in total obscurity. The Baltimore Cemetery is a vast historic resting place, filled with the monuments of the city's elite. But in Section E, Lot 169, there was nothing, just a patch of grass that looked like any other. His mother, Margaret, passed away decades later and was buried beside him. She, too, lay in an unmarked grave, the family's poverty following them to the very end. The world had moved on. The studio had dissolved. The copyright holders changed hands. The boy who had given his life for the laugh was erased from the earth. The silence was finally broken in 2012, not by a film studio or a museum, but by a rock musician from Detroit. McCall is not your typical film historian. A musician known for the underground rock scene, he possessed a deep, empathetic curiosity about the forgotten figures of the past. He, along with a loose collective of our gang enthusiasts and internet sleuths, began a project to locate the final resting places of the rascals. They found that many were tragic. Carl Alfalfa Switzer was shot to death over a $50 debt. Scotty Beckett died of a drug overdose. But Norman's story struck a particularly painful chord. When McCall traveled to Baltimore to pay his respects, he was stunned. He had the plot coordinates. He knew he was standing on the right spot, but there was nothing there. No stone, no name, no acknowledgement that a human being lay beneath his feet, let alone a Hollywood star. It was heartbreaking, McCall later said in interviews. Here was a guy who made the world laugh, and the world didn't even give him a rock with his name on it. They launched an online fundraising campaign. The goal was modest. They needed roughly $4,000 to purchase high-quality black granite headstones for both Norman and his mother, Margaret. They wanted to rectify not just the neglect of the actor, but the tragedy of the family. The campaign went viral within the vintage film community. It wasn't about big corporate donors. The money came in $10 and $20 increments from regular people, people who remembered watching The Little Rascals with their grandparents, people who felt a pang of guilt for laughing at the fat kid jokes now that they understood the reality. They raised $4,500. It was enough. On a crisp autumn Saturday in 2012, 76 years, 5 months, and 12 days after Norman's heart stopped, a crowd gathered at the Baltimore Cemetery. It was a motley crew. There were local historians, fans who had driven hundreds of miles, and distant relatives of the Chaney family who had heard about the event. The mood was not one of mourning, but of vindication. 2 headstones were unveiled. Margaret's stone is simple and elegant, honoring the mother who fought for her son. But Norman's stone is a masterpiece of tribute. It is made of polished black granite. Etched into the stone is a laser-engraved portrait of Norman from his Hal Roach days. It is not a caricature. It is a portrait of a handsome, smiling boy in a cap, looking out at the world with bright, intelligent eyes. The inscription reads, Norman Myers Chaney Chubby, October 18th, 1914 to May 29th, 1936. And below that, a simple line that acknowledges his contribution without defining him solely by it. For the first time in nearly a century, Norman Chaney was visible. He was no longer just a statistic of the Depression or a casualty of medical ignorance. He was a person with a name, a birth date, and a legacy. The story of Norman Chaney is a difficult mirror for the entertainment industry and for us, the audience. It forces us to confront the cruelty of the golden age of Hollywood. We look back at those films with nostalgia, but the machinery that produced them was often grinding up children to fuel the engine. Norman was a gig worker before the term existed, used for his physical abnormalities and discarded when he broke. He represents the thousands of child actors who never made the transition, who weren't protected by unions, and who were left to navigate adulthood with no skills, no money, and broken bodies. But his story is also a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. Despite a body that was failing him from age 3, despite the humiliation of the scripts, and despite the pain of his treatments, Norman remained, by all accounts, a gentle, kind, and optimistic soul. He didn't become bitter. He didn't lash out. He played the hand he was dealt with a grace that shames the people who exploited him. When you watch The Little Rascals today, you will still laugh. The timing is perfect. The gags are timeless. And you will see Chubsy stuck in a window wiggling his feet. But now, you know the truth. You know that inside that suit was a boy from Maryland named Norman. You know that he was fighting a battle against his own biology that no one understood. You know that he died weighing less than the girl he was trying to woo on screen. And you know that today, thanks to the kindness of strangers who refuse to let him be forgotten, he rests under a stone that finally treats him with the respect he earned. He was the heavyweight champion of the Roach lot. He was the boy who grew too fast. But in the end, he was simply Norman. And that is enough.